Scott screamed before any of us even saw her. I turned, and standing beside the back door of my car was a tall woman in a long black dress. Dirty, old, wrong in every possible way. She had the door wide open, and one leg was already halfway inside the vehicle. She wasn't panicking, she wasn't running, she was getting in. The terrifying part wasn't that she was there. It was that we'd spent the last 40 minutes completely alone in that place. Or at least, we thought we were. Let me back up to the very beginning, before everything went wrong. Growing up, there were certain places in my hometown that everybody knew about, but nobody ever talked about too loudly. You know the exact kind of place I mean. The kind of dark, forbidden corner that older kids whisper about during late-night sleepovers, passing down rumors like a curse. The kind of place that somehow, over decades, embeds itself into the very fabric of local mythology. For us, that place was the abandoned military village. Years later, driven by a lingering obsession, I eventually searched for the truth online. From what I found, the base had been heavily active during the chaotic years of World War II and throughout the height of the Cold War. At its absolute peak, it housed more than 200 military families. It wasn't just a collection of sterile, concrete barracks. It was an actual, fully functioning neighborhood, completely hidden away from the civilian world. It had residential streets. It had a church. It had family homes where people raised their children, cooked meals, and lived ordinary lives. And then, one day, it was abandoned, completely. No one in our town seemed to know the real reason why the military packed up and vanished overnight. And that heavy, suffocating uncertainty created decades of wild, terrifying rumors. By the time I was old enough to hear the stories, the village had already transformed into something legendary. Every single kid in town had heard some variation of the horror lurking within its gates. Some people claimed that demonic cults gathered there under the cover of night, performing rituals in the decaying structures. Others swore on their lives that the military used intricate networks of underground tunnels beneath the village for experiments that were never made public. Most of the stories directly contradicted each other, fueled by teenage imagination, but they all agreed on one undeniable, chilling thing. Something about that place felt wrong. The specific story that stuck with me most, the one that crawled under my skin and stayed there, came directly from my older brother. I was only in middle school at the time. A few of my friends were sleeping over at our house, and late one night, my brother walked into my bedroom, acting strangely serious. The usual joking, mocking older brother was entirely gone. He sat down heavily and told us that he and his friends had actually gone to the village. None of us believed him at first. We laughed it off as a cheap scare tactic. So to prove it, he began to describe it in excruciating, vivid detail. He spoke of the cracked, overgrown roads being swallowed by nature, the hollow, empty houses staring blankly into the dark, and the massive, looming church sitting directly in the dead center of the village. Then, he told us something I never forgot. He claimed that there was a hidden, heavy trap door built directly beside the altar inside the church. And he swore that when he and his friends pried it open, they heard distinct, horrifying sounds echoing up from the pitch-black abyss underneath, moaning, screaming. Looking back, he was probably just messing with us, almost definitely. But there was something uncomfortably raw about the way he told the story, a subtle tremor in his voice that stayed with me for years. It didn't feel completely fake. For years after that night, my friends and I constantly talked about exploring the military village ourselves. Every few months, like clockwork, somebody would bring it up during a dull evening. We should finally go. We've talked about this forever. What are we waiting for? But we never actually did it. Part of our hesitation was practical. Nobody actually knew the exact location. We knew it was tucked away somewhere near the airport, but that entire territory was filled with restricted roads, heavily guarded fences, and ominous no trespassing signs. And partly because, abandoned or not, it was still technically military property. The rumors warned that getting caught there sounded like the exact kind of high-stakes mistake that could seriously ruin your entire life. So, we kept putting it off. We kept making excuses. Until our senior year. It happened on a cool, crisp spring night. My friend Alex pulled me aside, out of earshot of the others, and quietly confided in me that he had finally acquired the exact directions to the hidden entrance. I immediately assumed he was bluffing, trying to sound brave. He claimed someone he knew had successfully navigated the path before and passed down the coordinates. I was so fiercely confident that he was lying to me that I threw down a challenge. I told him we should go right then and there, that exact same night. I figured we would just drive around randomly for 20 minutes, find absolutely nothing but empty woods, and go home satisfied that I had called his bluff. Around 11 o'clock at night, the four of us piled into my car, me, Alex, Nick, and Scott. The atmosphere in the car shifted almost immediately. Alex suddenly looked a whole lot less confident once the tires hit the pavement, and we actually started driving deeper into the isolated perimeter. Every few minutes, his hands would shake as he looked out the window, telling me to pull over because he thought he'd spotted the hidden entrance. And every single time, it was nothing. A drainage ditch, an old maintenance road, a frustrating dead end. But then, we found the actual road. It barely looked like a road anymore. The surrounding forest had almost completely swallowed it whole, branches scraping against the roof of the car like skeletal fingers. Hidden directly beside the overgrown entrance, tilted sideways at a sickening angle and heavily covered in thick vines, was an old, rusted no trespassing sign. Alex stared out the passenger window, his voice dropping to a breathless whisper. That's it. I just gripped the steering wheel, staring into the dark mouth of that overgrown road for a long, heavy second. Nick and Alex were already leaning forward from their seats, trying desperately to convince me to keep going. We'd been talking about this moment our entire lives. Were we really going to turn around now and live with the regret? Taking a deep breath, I reached down, shut off the headlights entirely to avoid detection, and slowly rolled the car forward into the absolute, suffocating darkness. The first security gate appeared out of the shadows just a few minutes later. It was one of those heavy metal security barriers designed to lift up only for authorized military vehicles. Nobody was there guarding it. The guard shack was empty and dark. I put the car in park, stepped out into the biting night air, manually lifted the rusted gate upward with a loud screech, and drove the car through. And that's the precise moment things started feeling profoundly strange. As the car crept forward in the dark, my eyes adjusted, and I realized that old furniture lined both sides of the dirt road. I'm not talking about dumped garbage or bags of trash. It was actual intact furniture. Bed frames leaning against trees, wooden dressers staring at the road, tables, chairs. It looked as though an entire neighborhood of people had simultaneously started moving their belongings out of their homes, and then, for some terrifying reason, suddenly stopped halfway through and fled. Nobody inside the car said a word. The silence was absolute. A second security gate loomed farther ahead in the gloom. This time, sensing my growing hesitation, Alex got out of the passenger seat to lift it manually. And after we passed that final checkpoint, we were officially inside the village. I've tried explaining to people what that place looked like before, and the absolute best comparison I can give is this. Imagine a completely normal, suburban neighborhood. Now, imagine that all the life, all the color, and all the energy had been violently drained right out of it. The houses weren't completely destroyed. They were just entirely, hollowly emptied. Some of the structures had collapsed inward under the weight of decades of neglect. Others looked almost completely untouched from the outside. Strangely, the untouched houses were somehow infinitely worse. They looked like they were holding their breath, waiting for someone to finally come back home. I slowly guided the car through the dead streets and parked directly in front of the looming silhouette of the church. We all got out of the vehicle quietly, closing the doors with soft clicks. Even talking out loud suddenly felt like a massive violation of the heavy silence. Our voices felt wrong in that space. The very first thing I did instinctively was look up into the dark eaves, searching for modern security cameras or motion sensors. I didn't see a single one. That realization helped soothe my racing pulse, if only a little. We decided to explore the church first. Our flashlights cut through the heavy dust motes inside. Crudely sprayed graffiti covered almost every square inch of the peeling walls. Despite my fear, a morbid curiosity took over, and I actually walked up to the altar, specifically looking for the hidden trapdoor my older brother had terrified me with when we were children. Of course, there was nothing there, just solid, rotting floorboards. After checking the church, we gained a bit of reckless confidence and started checking the abandoned houses. And honestly, the houses were the absolute creepiest part of the entire night. Not because they looked structurally haunted, but because they looked devastatingly real. These had been actual homes where real families lived out their private days. Children had grown up, laughed, and played within these walls. Now, everything smelled overwhelmingly of ancient dust, damp earth, and deep rot. Scott had been visibly nervous from the very microsecond we stepped out of the car. As we walked through the decaying rooms of a two-story residential home, he kept stopping dead in his tracks. He kept constantly looking over his shoulder into the shadows behind us. He kept frantically insisting to the rest of us that someone else was in the house with us. We kept annoyedly whispering back, telling him it was just his hyperactive imagination. We told him that abandoned, hollow places naturally mess with your head, that his panicked brain was creating monsters and problems that simply didn't exist. Then, all of us heard it. We were standing completely still inside one of the houses when the entire group froze at the exact same fraction of a second. A loud, heavy creak. This wasn't the random, ambient popping sounds that old, settling wooden buildings naturally make when the temperature drops. This sound was heavy, it was deliberate, it was rhythmically spaced apart. It sounded exactly like the unmistakable weight of somebody walking slowly across the wooden flooring in the dark house. Panicking, Alex immediately shouted blindly into the pitch-black darkness. "Hello?" The walking sound stopped instantly. Nobody moved a single muscle. We barely even breathed. Alex and Nick, desperate to maintain their composure, started trying to rationalize the noise right away, their voices cracking. Old houses make noise. The wood shifts. We were already nervous, so we're blowing things out of proportion. But Scott didn't say a word. He didn't even look toward the hallway. He just stared directly at me, his eyes wide, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, completely drained of color. And honestly, I was entirely done. Every single primal instinct buried deep in my DNA suddenly screamed at me to leave the village immediately. I firmly told everyone that we were turning around and going straight back to the car. Alex and Nick clearly wanted to stay longer and prove they weren't cowards, but I was the one holding the car keys. So we huddled close together and started cautiously heading toward the front door of the house. That's when Scott stopped dead in his tracks again. He didn't speak. He physically couldn't. Slowly, his trembling hand raised, and he pointed directly toward the dusty side window. Through the glass, illuminated by nothing but the faint ambient starlight, 3 distinct shadows moved across the glass pane. Not one single person. 3 clear, unmistakable human silhouettes. They were moving stealthily outside, right alongside the neighboring house. We watched them silently pass beyond the frame of the window and disappear directly behind the very house we were currently standing inside, which meant, logically, they were now positioned somewhere in the dark space right behind us. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slowly crept toward the rear exit and looked outside into the backyard. Nothing. The yard was completely, overwhelmingly dark. I looked back at my 3 friends, my face pale, and silently mouthed the words, "Run to the car, now." Everyone nodded. We didn't walk. We bolted. Scott was running slightly ahead of the rest of us when he suddenly let out a horrific scream, a real blood-curdling scream. The terrifying kind of sound that comes purely from raw, unadulterated human instinct when faced with absolute horror. And then, our flashlights swept over the vehicle, and we finally saw her. Standing directly beside the open back door of my car was a tall, incredibly thin woman. She was wearing a long, tattered black dress that looked ancient, caked in decades of dirt and filth. The rear passenger door was pulled wide open, and one of her long, emaciated legs was already halfway inside the vehicle. She wasn't panicking because we were running at her. She wasn't running away into the woods. She wasn't rushed or startled by our sudden, loud appearance. She looked completely, unnervingly calm. She was simply methodically getting into my car. The truly terrifying part of that realization wasn't just that she was there standing in front of us. It was the sickening mathematical reality that we had spent the last 40 minutes to an hour completely alone in that abandoned place. Or at least, we had blindly thought we were entirely alone. She had been tracking us the entire time. When Scott's scream ripped through the night air, the woman slowly, smoothly turned her upper body toward us. She didn't say a word. She slowly let go of the car door handle and walked directly into the open doors of the church. She didn't run. She walked with a calm, deliberate pace. We didn't wait to see if she or the other 2 silhouettes would come back out. We sprinted the remaining distance to the car like our lives depended on it, slamming and locking the doors. I jammed the key into the ignition, threw the car violently into drive, and sped back down the treacherous dirt road 10 times faster than I ever should have driven a vehicle. At one sharp bend, the tires lost traction on the loose gravel, and I almost lost control completely. For a horrific, fleeting second, I genuinely thought we were going to crash and be left stranded in the dark with whatever was out there. We didn't crash. We broke through the gates and didn't stop driving until we hit civilization. We didn't stop talking about what happened that night for years. If you sit down and try to analyze it rationally, the most obvious, logical explanation is that we simply encountered a group of aggressive squatters or unhoused people living secretly inside the abandoned military village. And honestly, on paper, that explanation makes perfect sense, mostly. But there are deep parts of that night that I still, to this day, cannot explain or reconcile. We had spent nearly an hour walking through those hollow buildings, talking loudly, and casting bright beams of flashlights everywhere. And somehow we never saw a single footprint, heard a single whisper, or noticed a single sign that anyone else was nearby. Not until the exact, precise moment we decided to pack up and leave. And even now, I still don't understand why that woman was trying so calmly to get into the back seat of my car. The military village was completely demolished by heavy machinery years later. I only found that out recently after my wife casually suggested we finally look up the old local legend online to see what became of it. Ironically, there's far more public information available about the base now than there ever was when we were impressionable teenagers. Back then, the absolute lack of information made the place feel infinitely more mysterious and dangerous. I'm just incredibly glad Scott screamed exactly when he did, because if we had reached that car just 10 seconds later, I honestly, truly don't know who or what would have been silently sitting in the dark back seat with us on the drive home. That brings me to the second account. A story that takes place years later, but carries that exact same flavor of absolute, paralyzing dread. I took one single step forward toward her, and the unstable floorboards creaking loudly beneath my foot. She stopped rocking instantly. The entire room went completely, suffocatingly silent. The shift was so sudden it felt like the air pressure in the house dropped. I could hear the fierce wind howling outside through the broken window panes. I could hear the rapid, shallow sound of my own breathing echoing in the small space. But the heavy rocking had stopped entirely. Terrified of a confrontation, I immediately started stammering out apologies into the dark. I loudly told her that we were sorry, that we didn't know anyone was currently living there, and that we would leave her property right away. Then, she started rocking again, slowly, back and forth, like she hadn't heard a single syllable I had just spoken. Like I wasn't even standing there in the room with her. Let me give you some context. Back when my wife and I first started dating seriously, we used to do a lot of reckless things that I would absolutely, under no circumstances, ever do now. It wasn't explicitly dangerous or criminal, just incredibly foolish and reckless. One of her biggest, most intense obsessions at the time was exploring abandoned urban buildings. Old, crumbling houses, forgotten factories, places that had been completely left behind by time. She absolutely loved finding tangible evidence that real, breathing people once lived there. She would search for old, decaying furniture, discarded family photographs, vintage clothes, and forgotten personal belongings left behind in the rush of abandonment. I wasn't nearly as fascinated by the historical romance of it as she was. Honestly, most of the time we were out there, I was just intensely worried that a rotting floorboard was going to collapse underneath our weight and drop us into a basement. But I went along with her anyway. I went because I really liked her, and because abandoned places admittedly possess a strange, intoxicating atmosphere that is incredibly difficult to explain to someone unless you've actually stood inside one yourself. Most of the structural skeletons we explored ended up being exactly what you'd rationally expect them to be. Empty, dirty, quiet. But one specific house was entirely different. And even now, after all these years, I still don't fully understand or accept what happened inside those walls. It was one of those dark, heavy autumn nights where the thick cloud cover completely blanketed the sky. There were no stars visible, no moonlight cutting through the dark, just absolute ink-black darkness. The house sat completely, eerily isolated from everything else around it. It wasn't located near a residential neighborhood, nor was it near any local businesses. It was just sitting there, entirely alone in the middle of overgrown fields. And the exact second my headlights washed over the facade, I didn't want to go inside. The entire structure looked completely unstable, even from a distance. The roof sagged heavily in the dead center, bowing under its own weight like a spine snapping. Several of the front windows were shattered into jagged teeth. The exterior walls looked slightly warped and skewed, as if the entire building was slowly, inevitably collapsing in slow motion under its own crushing weight. I turned to my girlfriend and firmly told her that we probably shouldn't go in, that it looked like a death trap. She ignored my warning completely, driven by the thrill of the find. The front door had been heavily boarded shut with thick wooden planks. I reluctantly raised my boot, kicked the rotting boards loose with a loud splintering crash, and we stepped over the threshold into the dark living room. The interior immediately stopped both of us dead in our tracks. Half of the living room floor was completely missing. There was a giant ragged hole right in the middle of the room, dropping straight down into the pitch-black basement below. We clicked on our flashlights and aimed the beams downward into the chasm. Standing, stagnant black water covered most of the basement floor, and broken household debris floated lazily in the muck. I remember staring at that gaping hole, shivering from the damp cold, and immediately saying, "We should leave right now." The house clearly was not structurally safe. She just turned to me, smiled her infectious smile, and said, "Give me 1 minute." That was always her signature line, and I knew from experience that 1 minute never actually meant 1 minute. It was her way of telling me she wasn't leaving until she satisfied her curiosity. She carefully stepped around the edge of the gaping floor hole and started moving deeper into the dark hallways of the house, while I chose to stay rooted right near the front entrance. Honestly, I didn't trust the floorboards to hold both of us. She just laughed at me from the dark, calling me paranoid. A few minutes passed in silence, and curiosity finally got the absolute better of my fear. I swallowed my anxiety and followed her deeper into the structure. The next room we entered was packed tight with random junk. Cardboard boxes, broken furniture, piles of old clothes. Everything was stacked in chaotic towers almost reaching the water-stained ceiling. She was already eagerly digging through the piles with her flashlight beam, searching for some forgotten keepsake or photograph. Suddenly, without looking up, she pointed her light toward the ceiling and said, "Go check upstairs." I immediately told her no. If the downstairs floor was missing, the upstairs was bound to be a nightmare. But before I could even finish formatting my argument, she cut me off, saying, "The faster we search the house, the faster we leave." And somehow, that flawed logic always worked on me. Reluctantly, I turned toward the staircase. Every single step I took creaked loudly beneath my feet, echoing through the hollow house. At the top of the dark staircase was a small hallway, with a bedroom situated on the immediate right side. I shone my light inside and entered that room first. To my surprise, the bed was still perfectly, immaculately made. At the foot of the mattress sat a neatly folded bathrobe, as if waiting for someone to step out of the shower. Heavy wooden furniture still stood exactly where it had probably sat for decades. It didn't feel abandoned in the traditional sense. It felt deeply, unsettlingly interrupted, like whoever lived there had simply vanished into thin air in the absolute middle of an ordinary day. The bedroom was heavily cluttered with old, intimate belongings, clothes hanging in a half-open closet, small, dusty decorations on the dresser. Then, my flashlight beam caught a small crawl-space door built into the far corner of the wall. Sometimes abandoned houses hide the strangest things inside crawl spaces, so I walked over and pulled the small door open. Inside, the space was filled with old baby supplies. Stacks of cardboard boxes filled with diapers, jars of expired baby food, and various children's items. Everything was heavily covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Some of the cardboard packaging had clearly been chewed apart by rodents over the years, and the smell coming out of that tight crawl space was absolutely horrible, a mix of dead mice and stagnant rot. I was just about to back my head out of the opening and slam the door shut when I heard it, creaking, slow, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper inside the actual wall of the house. I scanned the interior of the crawl space with my flashlight. In the far back corner, I noticed another narrow, tight opening leading deeper into the architecture of the house. It looked like a claustrophobic hidden passageway connecting this crawl space directly to the crawl space beneath the adjacent bedroom. The rhythmic creaking sound was definitively vibrating from that exact direction. I was way too physically big to ever attempt to crawl through that narrow gap. So, my heart rate accelerating, I backed completely out of the crawl space, shut the door, and headed down the dark hallway toward the second bedroom instead. The closer I got to the doorway, the louder and more distinct that rhythmic creaking became. At that point, I honestly tried to rationalize it. I thought I was about to run into a family of raccoons or some other wild animal nesting in the house. That was the only logical explanation that made any sense to my brain. Then, I stepped into the second bedroom, and I froze completely. A woman was sitting directly in an old wooden rocking chair near the far window. Her back was turned completely toward me. The chair was moving slowly, methodically back and forth. She wore a long, faded skirt that draped heavily over the dusty floorboards. I could see thin, wispy white hair rising above the high back of the wooden chair. For several agonizing seconds, I just stood there in the doorway, paralyzed, watching her rock. I tried desperately to look for her reflection in the dark, dirty glass of the window pane in front of her, but the angle was wrong. I couldn't see her face. Then, I instinctively took one cautious step forward. The floor creaked under my boot. She stopped rocking instantly. I apologized immediately, my voice trembling. I told her we didn't realize anyone lived here, that we were leaving right away. But she just sat there, frozen, before slowly beginning to rock again, back and forth. That absolute lack of reaction should have been more than enough to make me run out of the house. It really should have been. But for some bizarre, inexplicable reason driven by a strange sense of dread, I spoke into the dark and asked if she was okay. The rocking stopped a second time. Then she stood up, slowly, painfully slowly, as if her joints were screaming, and when she finally stood fully erect in front of the empty rocking chair, she started humming. She wasn't singing words, she was humming. A low, quiet, raspy hum. It sounded like she was desperately repeating the broken remains of an old, forgotten childhood melody. Then, suddenly, she started to turn around toward me, and I ran. I wish to God I could clearly describe her face to you. I can't. Everything happened way too fast, and my brain blurred the memory out of sheer self-preservation. I only remember terrifying, fractured flashes in my flashlight beam, ancient leathery skin, deeply carved wrinkles. But something about the geometry of her face looked fundamentally, deeply wrong. I sprinted down the creaking stairs at a breakneck pace, yelling at the top of my lungs to my girlfriend that somebody was upstairs. My girlfriend immediately started laughing out loud when I hit the bottom floor. She thought I was just playing a cheap prank, trying to scare her so we could leave. I grabbed her arm, begging her, pleading with her not to go up there. She ignored me completely. She playfully pushed right past me and headed straight up the stairs while I kept frantically telling her that we needed to run to the car. I ended up following closely behind her despite my terror, because I couldn't bear the thought of her going up there entirely alone. She reached the doorway to the second bedroom. She stopped. Then she suddenly gasped, "Oh my God." I rushed up beside her, expecting the worst, but she was laughing again. The old wooden rocking chair sat in the far corner of the room, completely empty. It was perfectly still. No woman, no movement, absolutely nothing. My girlfriend searched the entire room with her bright flashlight. She checked the dark corners. She even pulled open the small crawl space door and shone her light inside. Nothing was there. She kept laughing at me, teasing me, asking if I had seriously gotten terrified by an old, empty rocking chair. I swore to her on my life that a woman had been sitting right there, that she had stood up and hummed to me. She didn't believe a word of it. Eventually, she shrugged, satisfied that she had explored the house, and agreed we could finally leave. We turned around and started walking down the hallway toward the stairs. Then, we both heard it. Directly behind us, inside the bedroom we had just exited, the rocking chair started moving back and forth, back and forth. It wasn't a slow, gentle drift. It was moving with immense force. My girlfriend froze mid-step, so did I. There was absolutely 100% no doubt what our ears were hearing. Then came the humming, the exact same low, raspy melody I had heard moments before. Soft, patient, almost soothing, yet utterly malicious. My girlfriend slowly, tentatively stepped backward toward the open bedroom doorway to look inside. I stayed completely frozen in the middle of the hallway, unable to move my legs. She reached the edge of the doorway, and she immediately stopped moving. I watched her profile in the dark, her face completely, utterly changed. Her playful smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure unbridled horror. She stared into that room for maybe 2 agonizing seconds. Then, she violently turned around and ran past me. We didn't stop running until we broke through the front door, sprinted across the overgrown field, and slammed ourselves into the car. She was shaking violently, tears streaming down her face. And that was the specific part of the entire night that disturbed me the most. Because she was never scared, not once. Not in any dangerous, decaying, or abandoned building we had ever explored across the country. She was fearless. But that night, she couldn't stop frantically asking me the exact same question over and over again. What did we just see? What did we just see? I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. As I threw the car into reverse and drove away, a morbid urge washed over me, and I almost looked back up at the second-story bedroom window. Part of me desperately wanted to see if someone, or something, was standing against the glass, watching us flee into the night. But a deep primal survival instinct told me that if I looked, I would see her face clearly and I would never sleep again. I couldn't make myself do it. The logical, cynical explanation is that an elderly, mentally ill woman was somehow secretly squatting and living inside that collapsing house. And honestly, maybe that's the truth. Maybe she was real. But there are still massive parts of that night that don't add up cleanly to me. The heavily boarded front door that I had to physically kick loose. The giant, dangerous collapsing hole in the middle of the floor. And above all, the impossible way she completely and utterly disappeared into thin air by the exact microsecond my girlfriend checked the small room, only to reappear the moment our backs were turned. None of it adds up cleanly. Years later, when we were married, my wife brought the story up again on a quiet evening. Driven by a strange need for closure, we ended up driving all the way back to that isolated area. The house was entirely gone. It had been completely demolished down to the dirt. Not even a single piece of wood or debris remained in the field. Sometimes, I still think about that woman, about the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair, about that low, broken humming melody echoing from the dark. And sometimes, I wonder just how long she had been sitting alone in that room before we arrived, or worse. I wonder whether she's still sitting out there in that empty field somewhere in the dark, even now. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, remember, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some places are abandoned for a reason. This is our very first video on this channel, and believe me when I say we have a lot more terror in store for you. We are just getting started. If you want to survive the nightmares we have planned, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications, stay on the watch, and whatever you do, don't miss what's coming next. Let me know in the comments below, which story kept you looking over your shoulder tonight? Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows.